Welcome to Lesson 2, the purposes and conditions for marriage. I'm glad you're with us, and I pray that this will be a blessing to you. I'm confident that this information is timely, it's biblical, and it's helpful. Now, in our previous lesson, we talked about God's perfect plan for marriage, and we looked back to Jesus' teaching on marriage, and he looked back to Genesis 2 and to Adam's union with Eve. We thoroughly discussed that union, how it was planned by God, it was attacked by Satan, but God saved the marriage. And that gives you and others hope that anytime there's a marital problem, you call on the Lord and He will show you the way to correct the problem and restore the sweet union of the marriage. Now, in this lesson, we want to talk about the purposes of marriage and the conditions for marriage. First of all, let's look at the purposes. Point A, to help the man. This was the initial thought in God's mind. Man needed help. And so He created the woman to help him with love. And this helped the man to face the bitterness of life. When a husband has a loving wife, he can come home to a loving wife. It's a tremendous difference in his life, and as he faces bitterness with other relations, in different relationships, and in his work or profession, he can come home to the love of a wife. Then also, the woman helps the man with company. This helps him and keeps him from being lonely. Adam was alone, and God said it's not good for the man to dwell alone. So Eve helped Adam with his, if you will, loneliness problem. And then with assistance, a wife helps a husband in the difficulties of life. Often a man's best advice comes from his wife. Now, women, your husband probably won't acknowledge that, but it's true. So it's a great blessing to have a woman who is not only beautiful and loving, but wise, that is, makes good decisions and is well informed and knowledgeable. So the man needs assistance in the difficulties of life, and a wife provides that. Genesis 2:18 again says that the wife is to be a helper, meet or fit, suitable for him. Now, Proverbs 18:22 tells us, whosoever finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor of the Lord. So the Proverbs acknowledges that a wife is a good thing and a help to the man. Now, Satan's purpose, and this doesn't take a brilliant scholar to figure this out, is the opposite. Instead of helping the man, he wants to use the woman to hinder the man. Now, we have several examples I want to give you. First of all, Proverbs 21:19 says that a woman hinders a man by constant complaints and arguments. The contentions of a wife are a continual dropping, Proverbs 19:13. And then it is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and an angry woman, Proverbs 21:19. So Satan's plan is to use a woman and her contention to undo the man. Now we have examples here of Zipporah. She forbade that Moses obey God in the matter of circumcising their second son. She was quite angry when God required this action, and Moses complied. Zipporah was quite angry about it. So she did not support him in obeying his God. This is a significant thing. She opposed him in his faith and obedience to God. And of course, as I'm reading these examples, you may know of or you may be in a situation which is similar to this. And remember, you can apply role reversals here. When I'm talking about a woman, the same may be true of a man. We see here that the woman can hinder the man also by demeaning him. Michal talked down to David. Here David was God's chosen king. He was beloved of God, but he wasn't beloved of Michal. She clearly preferred her father, Saul, to David. And when David danced before the Lord in his ephod for joy that the ark was returning, was coming to Jerusalem, she demeaned him and she reproached him, put him down. So this hindered the man. And then we have the incident that we read in the first lesson, which was Eve's suggestion that Adam partake of the tree which they were forbade to touch. So she suggested disobedience to God, and he, of course, sinned by agreeing with her. So a wife that suggests sin or disobedience to a husband is hindering the husband, and vice versa. And I have Job 2, verses 9 and 10 here, where Job's wife was very discouraging to him in a terrible situation. He had lost his children, all his property, and now he had lost his health. He was sick, covered from head to foot with boils. And his wife turned to him and she said, "Go ahead and curse God and die. Why do you retain your integrity?" So she did not support him in his lowest hour. This was a very egregious failure of her duty as a wife. So she discouraged him at the lowest moment in his life and thus hindered him. And then we have an example of Jezebel and Ahab. Well, we know that Jezebel was very willful, and by wily willfulness and sexual manipulation, she controlled her husband. Now, we don't have direct evidence that she used sexual manipulation, but we do have evidence in the Bible that she painted her face, and so she was very conscious of her physical beauty, and this would imply that she would do that. We saw her acting willfully in the scripture in the matter of Naboth and his vineyard, where she actually set up a false court and had Naboth killed, murdered really, so that Ahab could take his vineyard. So we see the wiliness and the ruthlessness of Jezebel. Some men have these kinds of wives to deal with, yes. So you see how in all these ways Satan's purpose is the opposite of God's, to use the wife to hinder the man. And again, I will say these roles can be reversed. Satan can use the man to hinder the woman. Now, also the purpose of marriage was to provide for the woman. First of all, love. A woman wants to be loved and cared for and cherished and adored. And so the first duty of a man is to love his wife. And therefore, in Ephesians 5:25, Paul says, "Husbands, love your wives." He didn't just say pay the bills and live in the same house. Love them, really care for them. Think about their needs and see to those needs and delight in your wife. And then the next thing here on our syllabus, on our study guide, tells us that the man provides provision for the woman. Now, I know we live in a different culture today. We have a lot of working women, and in many households, the woman is providing along with the man, or sometimes more than the man. But in the ideal plan, the man is providing for his wife. So when a woman has love and she has provision, she doesn't have to worry about the bills being paid. This makes her, and if you look on your study guide, the next item is security. This makes her secure. She feels safe. Then protection. The man is to protect his wife. It's a terrible thing, an egregious sin when a man forsakes his wife in a scenario of danger. He should be the first to step up and protect her with his own life if necessary. Now we have the example of Ruth chapter 3, verse 1, where Naomi is speaking to Ruth and she says, "My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee?" What's she talking about? Was she wanting to find a bed where Ruth could go to sleep? No, she was referring to marriage. She was saying, "Ruth, here we are in need. We're having to glean from the fields to survive." She said, "I want you to find a husband who can give you rest." And of course, that did come to pass because Ruth found Boaz. So this is God's purpose for the woman, to provide love, provision, security, and protection within the marriage relationship. Next, to facilitate procreation. This is one of his most primary purposes. The race has to be continued, and for that purpose, we have to have married people having babies. Sort of simple there, isn't it? And so in Genesis 1:28, that's your reference, God said to Adam, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." Later he said to Noah in chapter 9 and to his sons the same thing. Charge them to be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth after the flood had destroyed the earth's population. So procreation is a primary purpose of marriage. Some people don't want children, that is their option. But if you're a Christian and you're able to have children, certainly this is God's will and plan. If you're having difficulty becoming pregnant and you're a wife there, pray for the Lord to help you become pregnant, because this is His plan. And in the Bible, God has helped many women who were apparently barren to become fruitful. There's just a long list of them. Gosh, Rebecca and Manoah's wife and Elizabeth. It goes on and on. So pray that He will help you become fruitful, and you and your husband will have children. Next, the purpose of marriage is to avoid fornication. Now, this was very important in the Jewish rabbis' thinking of the first century. They wanted men to marry as soon as possible to avoid being tempted to commit fornication. Usually, the young girls were married as soon as they hit puberty, and they married sometimes as early as 14. But this was their way of sparing their society from the ill effects of fornication. It kept their society from falling into the immorality that was typical of the pagan world. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 and 2, and this is in your study guide, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. And of course, this works both ways. It helps the wife find satisfaction in her husband and be less tempted to find it elsewhere. To give pleasure. Well, this is the most obvious thing about marriage. There are conjugal relations, and there's great physical pleasure. In Psalm 16, verse 11, I've got that in your study guide, David wrote, "At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore." So marriage is one of the holy pleasures that God provides for His covenant people. In Psalm 145:16, the Bible says, "Thou openest thine hand and satisfies the desire of every living thing." So in marriage, God satisfies our natural sexual drive righteously. Proverbs 5, verses 15 through 19 tell us, "Rejoice with the wife of thy youth, let her breasts satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love," that is, and not another, not a strange woman. We know the Song of Solomon speaks of Solomon's relationship with one of his wives, and gives us a very detailed description of marital love, which is holy. 1 Timothy 6:17, there Paul tells us that God gives us richly all things to enjoy. So obviously, pleasure is a key part of the marriage relationships. By the way, the Greeks sometimes, and their philosophers, felt that it would be great to have a sexless marriage, and so some unions were forged like that. But that, of course, would make procreation impossible, and that would prevent them from, men and women, from keeping the population of the earth restored. Marriage also establishes and perpetuates family life. In other words, it perpetuates the family unit. God ordained this to love and protect children in childhood. Children are with us such a short time. They just come and they go. They're 1 and 2 and 3 years old, and suddenly they're graduating from college and they're out of the home. So while they're in the home, the family unit is there to provide love and protection for children in childhood. It is so much needed. Also, to prepare children for adulthood and to nurture them in God's fear, as Paul discusses in Ephesians 4, verse 6. "Fathers, do not exasperate your children, but bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord." You know, telling and showing your children that you believe God is awesome is the sure way to convince them to also walk in awe of God, in the fear of God. You know, when the fear of God is upon us, we naturally stand in awe of His awesomeness, His immensity, His power, His greatness, His wisdom, which is incomprehensible. And in that awe, we naturally believe Him, obey Him, and worship Him. This is God's plan. Now, as regards children, I just want to note something and call it to your attention. Immediately after Jesus taught on marital fidelity in the passage we just read, Matthew 19, 3 through 12, He expressed His strong compassion for children. Let's read that passage and note this in Matthew 19, verses 13 through 15. Immediately after Jesus has talked about marital fidelity and those who choose to live the single or celibate life, He adds this, "Then were brought unto Him little children, that He should put His hands on them and pray, and the disciples rebuked them. And Jesus said, Permit little children, and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. And He laid His hands on them and departed from them." Now in Mark's gospel, he says that Jesus was angry. This is a rare expression found in the Gospels regarding Jesus, but Mark says He was angry that His disciples would not let the children come to us. What does this show us? That He loves children intensely. So after Jesus speaks about marital faithfulness, He then, the Bible, naturally in its next context, tells us that Jesus was angry when children could not come to Him. So He cares intensely for children. He wants marriages to remain faithful so they can take care of children. That's the link I see here in one context following the other. Okay, let's note on point B that also this care for the children in the home involves teaching, training, and counseling them. Teaching them is very important. Informing your children well. You know, in households where the parents have intellectual interest, the children grow up with curiosity. They want to learn. They want to discover things that are in the world naturally. And then as Christians, they want to know the Bible from cover to cover. They want to know all there is about Jesus. And they have to be informed for them to have the proper experience of walking with God. So the parents inform the children, and then they also warn them of all the dangers of life. My goodness, life is just fraught with dangers of every kind on every side. So it is the parents' responsibility to inform the children of those dangers, to warn them. Then there's training, instruction in self-discipline. Now this, of course, assumes that the parent is disciplined. So if you're a parent, I'm speaking to you, you discipline your life naturally and spiritually. Then you can help your child learn discipline. You know, when children grow up without discipline, my goodness, it's just terrible. They need this training because you have to have natural discipline to prosper in whatever you do in life, whether it's a profession or a trade or in ministry. So when they're in the home, that's the time to train children to be self-disciplined. That is, that they will discipline themselves and they don't have to have the parent standing over them and say, make your bed or clean up your clothes or do this, that, and the other. They do it themselves. So train the children while they're in the home. Then counseling them. When they come to you with their problems at school, and my goodness, that could be a wide array of problems. We're having difficulties with friends, they're having difficulties with someone of the opposite sex, difficulties dealing with a teacher or a principal. You, the parent, can counsel them and give them godly counsel to help them navigate those problems. Proverbs 4, verses 1 through 4 says, "Hear ye children the instruction of a father. I was my father's son, and he taught me also." Here, Solomon is telling us that David took the time to teach him and train him about the affairs of life. He was just a child. Then there's disciplining. Children need discipline. They need to know there are limits. They need to know that there are consequences for disobedience, for breaking the rules. And this is learned in the home. If the child learns that when he breaks the rules in the home, he's going to have consistent punishment, then after a while the child, if he's normal, catches on. And this will carry over into his relations in society. A child that continually presses the limits at home is going to do the same at school and at work and with the law, and they're going to get in trouble. and they're going to harm themselves. They will become their own worst enemy because they don't relate to authority well. So while they're in the home, the parents are the authority, and God has set this up so that they learn the right relationship to authority in their dealings with their parents. So you as a parent have to be consistent, you have to be firm and loving, but you have to instill in the child the knowledge that if they break the rules of the home, there will be consequences. If you withhold those consequences, then they're going to go out into society and they're going to think they can break rules there and evade the consequences. So discipline is important. Proverbs 3:12, even as a father corrects the son in whom he delights. This is the way you and I should train our children. Discipline is a sign of love. Then there's watching over them. Boy, this is so important. I have a reference to Esther 2, verse 11. Mordecai, who was Esther's older cousin, walked every day before the court. This is the Persian court. To know how Esther did and what would become of her. So after she entered the royal harem, Mordecai still watched out for her to see how things were going with her. Now, I want to apply that to parents watching over their children. You know, you have to keep an eye on your children and know where they are at all times. And if you can't oversee them, I'm speaking now of young children particularly, when they get older, it's different. You have to give them liberty. But when they're young, you must know where they are at all times or have someone that you can trust to take care of them. If you just let them run loose, they could be subject to all kinds of harm, including pedophiles who are out there in large numbers. Then you cover them by intercession, point E. Job 1, verse 5 for a reference. The Bible tells us that Job offered burnt offerings for his children and, quote, thus did Job continually, end quote. Also, Ephesians 6:18 tells us that Paul orders us to pray always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit for all saints and for him. That would certainly include for our children. I cannot overstress the importance of intercession. Everything in life begins with intercession. If you have a problem, start praying about it. If you have a need, start praying about it. If you want to raise your children right, start praying for them every day, for them to know the Lord and to walk closely with Him and to love His Word, to receive His Spirit, to receive His correction, to walk in His ways. So pray for them every day. Cover them by prayer, and prayer particularly in the Spirit. God will honor this. You know, Jesus said, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you shall ask what you will and it shall be done for you. John 15. So you remain in close contact with the Lord and you pray for those children to come into that close walk themselves. Then I've added a point that's not in your study guide. I'm calling it point F, and I'm saying modeling Christian living or modeling the Christian walk. You as a parent are charged to walk the walk that you talk. If you talk the walk, walk it. This makes a powerful and a lasting, perhaps even a saving impression on your children. You know, I can think of my mom and my dad. They're both passed now, but I think of the strengths in my mother, her strong faith, her complete commitment. I think about my dad's work ethic. He was a very hard worker and had a successful business. And I think about the example that they set me. Both were Christians, and they walked the walk that they talked. And this left an impression on me, even beyond their words. I think about their ways, how my dad went about his work, how my mother was so committed to Christ. And it's made a deep impression, lasting impression on me. It's helped form my character. Now, at this point, I want to point out to you that single parents are often so stressed by life that they just leave off these points of training their children, or they become very lax in these duties. They don't have time to teach and to train their children like they should. They don't counsel them because they're stressed out and need counsel themselves. They don't discipline them because they're not disciplining themselves. They're so stressed out with life and difficulties and earning a living and paying the bills and dealing with people who give them a hard time. So single parenthood is not God's ideal. Now, if you are in that situation, don't feel condemned. Accept the life as it has been given to you. Make the best of it. There's so many young men and women in the world who had great mothers, or in some cases great dads, who were single parents, and they loved them, they worked hard for them, they trained them in the Lord, they trained them in the Bible, they trained them in life, and they grew up to be awesome Christians. So because it's not God's order, don't give up. Don't be discouraged. So if you're a single parent, you be of good courage and follow these to the best of your ability. Also get family and friends to help you. Do this, and God will honor that. Okay. Now also, in the home, there is a reflection of the mystery of the Trinity. We have a reference to Genesis 1:26 and 27, where God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image, male and female created he them. What does this tell us? That there is a paternal and a maternal aspect about the Godhead. We can't fully explain it, but it's there. There's something in God that's male, there's something in God that's female. And so this is a mystery of the divine nature, and this has been replicated in our binary gender setup. Of course, that too is being challenged in our day. But God is not confused, and Christians should not be confused either. We're male and we're female. Now, it also reflects the Trinity in this sense that there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And in the same way in a home, there's a father and a mother and a child. There's a triune parallel in the home to the triune Godhead. Furthermore, it reflects these mysteries, the mystery of God's relationship to Israel, his covenant relationship, which is likened to a marriage. And in that relationship, I would inform you today that God himself is suffering divorce as I speak. He was wedded to Israel in Exodus 20 in a great ceremony where he declared his will and the people agreed. They took their vows. And Israel walked with God through their long and storied histories, at times faithful, at times worshiping idols, at times being blessed by God, at times being chastened by God. But the covenant has held continuously. However, when Jesus came and the Jewish people rejected him, they divorced God, as it were, and now God is in a divorce scenario. But he has vowed in Habakkuk that he will betroth his people unto him, take him in holy matrimony again. And the Jews at this moment are awaiting spiritual conversion when they will be restored to covenant relationship with Yahweh, and this time by receiving Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. So this reflects that just in some degree. Our marriage reflects that to some degree. Also, Christ and his church. Christ is the bridegroom, and the church is the bride. This symbolism was used by Jesus in Matthew 25. Verses 1 through 13, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, which is a key parable for you to understand as we await the Lord's return. So he chose this symbolism deliberately and intentionally. The church is called the bride of Christ, and there's rejoicing in heaven in Revelation 19 that the bride has made herself ready, wholly sanctified, unified, ready for union, eternal union with Christ. So let me quote the Phillips Bible from Ephesians 5:32. Paul tells us this: "The marriage relationship is a great mystery, but I see it as a symbol of the marriage of Christ and his church." Also, marriage is to glorify God. Point 4 on your study guide. By doing his will instead of our will, by following his pattern instead of the patterns in our society today, which are becoming stranger by the hour, and then by living in his way in marriage. That is, in Adam and Eve, God established a model, a paradigm, if you will, and he wanted his people to follow that for perpetuity. So by doing so, we're glorifying God. Now, by contrast, Genesis 6, verses 2 and 12, and this is in your study guide, tell us this, that the antediluvians, the pre-flood generation, quote, took them wives of all they chose. Any woman that they were attracted to, they took them to themselves. They became their wives. All flesh was corrupted. All flesh, corrupted his way upon the earth. So by polygamy, they corrupted God's way, which was monogamy. And this, as I said in the earlier lesson, accelerated the degeneration of society. They corrupted God's way of marriage, which was monogamy, and they corrupted God's way of life, which was peaceful. And the more this polygamy proliferated and this lust and pride in this generation of doing things their own way instead of God's way, the more violence grew and they became more murderous until God had to execute an extinctive judgment. Point 5 tells us to strengthen and sanctify the church. Marriage is the foundation of the family, and family is the foundation of the church. We said that earlier. So by strengthening marriage, we're strengthening the church. Also to stabilize and bless society. If we were to envision a societal pyramid, a social pyramid, on the bottom would be marriage, then family, then church, and then society on top. For societies to thrive, there have to be healthy churches. For churches to thrive, there have to be healthy families. And for families to thrive, there have to be healthy marriages. That's the social pyramid. Also, to promote personal development and spiritual growth. In marriage, we, on a daily basis, interact with our spouses, and then when we have children, also with our children. In these interactions, and they are so varied, so many possible scenarios, we learn to deal with other people in love. We learn to speak the truth in love instead of in haste. We learn to be patient. We learn to be forbearing. We learn that we can't always have our way. We need to defer to our wife or the wife to her husband. Sometimes to defer to the children. Often the children are wanting everything in the world. And so you can't defer to their wishes or sometimes their demands. And so you learn there to stand firm in authority while you're being resisted, while you're being challenged. That is part of how you grow the character of Jesus Christ. You know, His life is in you, and it's developed through these interactions of spouses and interactions with children. Sometimes they're very difficult, very challenging. Jesus said in Matthew 10, sometimes your family would be divided, 2 against 3 and 3 against 2. Because some believe and some do not, or some are professing Christians that walk with God, others are professing Christians who do not walk with God. So in any of these situations, you are the wood, and this interaction is sanding you to polish your character. You are the rock of Christ who is within you, and so your life is being chiseled by these interactions so that by your trust and obedience to God and His Word in every situation, you're becoming more like Christ, and His image is being sculpted in you, or you're the clay. And God is using these scenarios and interactions as His fingers in His hands. Sometimes He presses in ways you don't like. But learn to always yield to the will of God. And He's forming you like a potter does with the clay on the wheel. You're whirling around and life seems like it's out of control. Just keep focused on Jesus. Stay close to Him. And you obey the Word. You said, but my husband or my wife, they're not obedient. They don't seek the Lord. Well, you seek the Lord and you be obedient. And then God will work through you and help stabilize your home and bring it eventually into divine order. All right, so now let's talk about point 2, the conditions for marriage. To marry, one must be scripturally free. We'll use that term in the remaining lessons frequently. Scripturally free or at liberty. This is used in 1 Corinthians 7:39. What does it mean? Well, it means you're single and therefore eligible for marriage. And you're one of the following. You have never before married. You are what Paul calls a virgin. Okay, you've never married. Or you're a widow or a widower. You've had a loving spouse, but they died, so you're left alone. Now, in 1 Corinthians 7:8 and 9, Paul says this, I say to the unmarried and to the widows or widowers, It is good for them if they abide even as I, that is, single, choose to live a celibate life. But if they cannot have self-control, if they don't have the gift to live the single life and they want a spouse very much, then he says, let them marry. Listen to that. Let them marry. In other words, it's okay to marry. To remarry in this case. For it is better to marry than to burn. Now that word burn, and Craig Keener explains this in your textbook, in ancient literature, Greco-Roman literature, that was used quite frequently to speak of the burning passion, burning sexual passion. So Paul says if you can't control your passions, you need to get married. You need to pray for a spouse and find a spouse, and then God will sanction holy sex in marriage. So he says, let them marry. Now let's look on in our study guide. To marry, you need to also be, or you may also be, validly divorced. You had a spouse, they were unfaithful. Either they abandoned you or they were repetitively unfaithful. And through counsel and through prayer, they did not respond. They remained impenitent, so you were forced to divorce them. You're validly divorced. That divorce was biblical. Jesus said, except for the cause of fornication. Remember our exception clause in Matthew 19? So if you are validly divorced, then you are eligible. You are single and therefore eligible for remarriage. Or you may be a victim of invalid divorce. That is, your spouse divorced you against your will, against your pleadings, against your prayers, against the counsel of others. What happened? Well, they became impenitent in their sin and they became adamant, like a stone. And they were determined to end the marriage. You know, when one of the two parties says, I'm out of here, and they do not respond, as I just said, to counsel, to friends, to family, to children, and you're interceding, and they just won't yield. They're just like a rock. When they divorce you, then you are technically a victim of invalid divorce. Now, let me just say here, never develop the victim attitude. Don't think of yourself as a victim. As I just said earlier, God himself has been abandoned and rejected by his own people Israel. So God knows about this. If you've been hurt deeply by your spouse rejecting you and divorcing you, God knows all about it. Go to him and tell him about it. And the Holy Spirit, who is the comforter, will supernaturally keep you while you go through a divorce that's being forced upon you. But once that is cleared, and I would add to that, once you're emotionally restored, it takes a while to get over a divorce, particularly when people have been married for a while. Just like if you are in an accident in an automobile and you have a collision at 50 or 60 miles an hour head on, if you survived that, you're likely to be broken up in your body. You're going to go through months in the hospital and then another year or two of rehab before you come back to normalcy physically. Well, in the same way, when you have a terrible divorce, it impacts you psychologically and emotionally, and it takes you a while to recover. And so that you have no bitterness about the sin of your former spouse against you. You're not talking about them behind their backs. They're not dominating your mind. You're free. You've forgiven them, and you've moved on with Jesus. When you're in that condition, then you're eligible, should God will, for you to be remarried. So that's what that is about. I would add one more point too, and it may or may not be in your syllabus, a forgiven offender. What is a forgiven offender? This is someone who divorced their spouse without cause. They were the villain in this divorce action. But subsequently, they confessed their sin, they were convicted, and they repented. They even sincerely tried to reconcile with their former spouse, patiently and prayerfully, but they were unsuccessful. So this is a forgiven offender. Remember, as egregious as unjustified divorce is, it is a forgivable sin. It's not the unforgivable sin, which is blaspheming the Holy Spirit. So forgiven offenders are also in a position where they are eligible for remarriage. These are the ones who are eligible for remarriage. Single people who are either never before married, or they're widows or widowers, or they're validly divorced, or they've been invalidly divorced, or they are a forgiven offender. To these, Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 7, 27 and 28. Art thou loosed from a wife? That is, have you been loosed through a divorce action or bereavement? Seek not a wife, Paul advises, but and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. Now listen to that. If you marry, you have not sinned. Some people feel like those who get married again are sinful, that they're getting married because they're just some lustful person. No. Paul says, if they marry, they have not sinned. Then he adds this, nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. What is this trouble in the flesh? Well, one thing is that you'll have two wills, two persons and two wills under the same household, which naturally creates friction. Sometimes one will want to take a certain course of action, the other will not. Sometimes you will feel strongly God wants this, and your spouse will not agree with you. You have to learn how to disagree agreeably. This is part of your spiritual growth and maturation process. It's a very important part. So Paul is telling us this is going to happen. He's saying, look, if you get married, you're going to have some challenges that a single person will not have. When Israel wanted a king, the Lord told them bluntly, he said, this is the nature of the king. If I give you a king, this is what he's going to do. He's going to charge you taxes. You're going to have to pay him taxes so you can support his royal lifestyle. He's going to take your sons and send them off to war, and they may die. But the people wanted the king anyway, so God gave them the king. All right, so here, these are the people who are eligible for marriage. And Paul has said very clearly in 1 Corinthians 7, 8, and 9, let them marry if they're single, never been married, or they're widows or widowers. And of the others who have been through some kind of divorce action but have recovered, as I've described, to them he says, if you marry, you have not sinned. Now, what do we take from this? What should we conclude? Well, succinctly, if God says, let them marry, and of course when Paul is writing in the Scriptures, this is inspiration. So here we have, as I said earlier when I began the course, we have authority. We have authority. This is incontrovertible. As Keener says, if we call Jesus Lord, he has the right to tell us what to do and how to live. And of course, in this case, Jesus is speaking posthumously by the inspiration of the Spirit through his pen, Paul the Apostle. So if God says, through Paul, let them marry, we too must permit them to marry and not forbid them. And if God says, thou hast not sinned, we must not say that they have. Okay, this ends Lesson 2, and we'll begin in a few moments with Lesson 3, the fragility, maintenance, and terminuses of marriage.